What's going on, folks? This is Big Brother's Perspective. I want to do this video on the greatest entertainer that ever lived, and that's no other than the late, great Michael Jackson. And look, there ain't no new King of Pop. There ain't no new Michael Jackson because I see a lot of people trying to compare these modern singers to him. You know, they say Beyonce's the new Michael Jackson, Usher, Chris Brown. Some say Drake's the new Michael Jackson. And though they may be talented, I wouldn't go as far as to say they're the next Michael Jackson because um, it's just not the same. Not to mention that we've seen some artists in the past who tried their best to be like them. And I'm not talking about being inspired, but basically being Michael Jackson instead of just being original and working on their own crafts. Because I believe that God gave us all our own gifts, and Michael's talent was strictly his. And that's the thing some people don't realize. But the thing is that Michael Jackson was what I would call a global diplomat because every time Michael stepped off a plane in a foreign country, he was acting as a diplomat. He shook hands with leaders, he kissed babies, and he used his music to speak to people who didn't even know his language. He was that friendly face of a culture that was building a bridge so that people in Japan, Africa, and Russia felt like they knew us and we knew them. And that's really the definition of diplomacy. But he was also the Secretary of State, too, because he became the one in charge of the whole entire operation. Because this dude didn't just show up, he dictated the terms. You know, he was the one in the boardrooms making sure the culture was respected and represented on his terms. Because we could talk about how the MTV situation, how that played out when he broke the color barrel, or we could talk about how he got global governments to let him film at the very places they wanted to have from the world, and he was just the chief that sat at the top and decided what the policy of pop culture was going to be. He followed the rules, but he also wrote them too. And right now, I'm feeling that the critics are attacking this diplomat because they're afraid of his power. Because right now, the media is dogging the new Michael movie. They're giving it 30% and 40% scores, calling it too safe or too positive. And I can't comment on it because I haven't seen it yet, but I'm planning on seeing it soon. But I have seen the trailers and the highlights and some scenes from the movies that's been leaked, and it looks pretty good. And, you know, we all know, of course, they got Michael's nephew, Jafar Jackson, playing him, who sounds naturally like Mike. You know, it doesn't sound like a cheap impression. And he do look like him, too, you know, at times, but more so like his father, Jermaine, for the most part, than he does Michael. Because I think Wiley Draper, rest in peace, was the best pick for Michael Jackson that I've seen in the Jacksons, the American Dream movie, a movie which we all grew up watching. Then, you know, we had the Man in the Mirror movie, which came out years later with Flex Alexander, which a movie I wasn't too crazy about. And when I seen that this new Michael Jackson movie was coming out, I honestly wasn't that excited at first, since we already know Michael's life. We know that he was born in Gary, Indiana. We know he had a troubled relationship with his father, Joe, who was strict. We know he worked the shit out of Mike and his brothers. He whooped ass when they messed up. You know, things we already know. And just the fact that we already got the biopics and then the endless documentaries, you know, you just feel burnt out from all of that. But now I'm feeling different about it. And after seeing what I saw from this film, I don't think that this is just another regular production because this film was directed by a black man, Antoine Fuqua, and it got Mike's nephew Jafar playing him. And this movie could be made as a reintroduction to the younger generation who was born in the 2000s and 2010s, since a lot of them tend to think that Thriller was the start of Michael's career. But like I said, I don't think this film is going to show us anything new, like new hidden facts. I mean, they may just show some behind the scenes stuff of Michael's reactions or how he felt about certain things that we already know. That's about it. But the movie does show an era that they rarely touch on about his life, and that's the off the wall era, which I saw in one of the trailers. The snippet of the "Don't Stop Till You Get Enough" video when Mike was finding his own voice as a man before the Thriller madness took over, which I would like to see. And there's supposed to be a sequel, a part two of this movie of its later years that's coming out later on. I heard like next year or so, and the media is dogging this movie out, and really I think it's because it shows Michael Jackson as a Secretary of State of black culture. It shows a young black man from Gary, Indiana, negotiating his way into every living room on the planet. It shows him winning. And the media always had a hard time with a narrative where Mike's the hero, the victor, and the diplomat who brought the world together. Because, I mean, look at 1984. You had Ronald Reagan, the president of the United States at the time, standing next to Mike at the White House. But let's be real, Reagan wasn't the one doing Michael a favor. The president needed to stand next to Michael Jackson just to stay relevant with the youth and the culture. The leader of the free world had to borrow some of that Thriller magic just to look like he was in touch. But this movie focuses on the first half of Michael's life, the Black Michael eras. And they don't want you to dwell on the off-the-wall or Thriller years because that Michael was untouchable. You know, he was the bridge. He was the one who forced MTV to stop segregating music. In this movie, you know, we see him in his prime, black and powerful. Just like on the Motown 25 special, for example, when he did the moonwalk. Because on that night, he moved from being this child star to being a representative for a new generation of black excellence. He made history on a black stage. He didn't need a mainstream white award show to become the biggest thing on the planet. And it is at that point now where when we hear Billie Jean, we can't think of any other dance but what we saw on Motown 25. Because, I mean, I wasn't even born when that special first premiered, but I've seen that clip all my life, and that song is almost equivalent to that performance. But the media calls this sanitized, but for us it's restoration. It's seeing the Michael Jackson the world fell in love with before the tabloids try to tear his name apart. And here's my prediction. When part 2 drops, the years where he was lighter and the years of the trials and all that shit he went through, watch how the media's tone changes. Because suddenly those same critics would give it 5 stars because they would prefer the version of Michael that's suffering. They want the tragedy. They want the wacko jacko narrative because it fits the story they've been telling us for 30 years. They'll praise the honesty of part 2 only because it makes them feel right about turning their backs on them back in 2006. But if part 2 was balanced, where they also show the positive side of Michael Jackson, then the media is going to have a hard time because Michael started using his platform around that time to teach actual history. Because, like, look back, like, the Remember the Time video, he was making a statement. He showed the world that black people didn't start as slaves. We started in crowns. He put Egypt back in Africa where it belongs. He showed us as kings and queens, and the media hates that because it disrupts the victim narrative that they want to keep us in. And they don't want to see Mike being crowned a king of a village in Ivory Coast or celebrating that ancient excellence. And then on top of that, we got to talk about the black or white video, specifically the ending that they censored and edited out. We saw the Black Panther symbolism, and the Black Panther transforms to Mike, and Mike was out there smashing the KKK symbols and the swastikas. He was physically destroying the symbols of hate. But they made it look like he was just out there going crazy, jumping on people's cars, breaking their windows, screaming at the sky and shit, grabbing his nuts. And the media called it violent and weird, but he was being the Secretary of State for every person who had been oppressed. He was taking diplomacy off and putting the gloves on. And they edited it because they wanted the Disney version of Michael, not revolutionary Michael. And they also don't want us to remember when he went to Brazil to film They Don't Really Care About Us. The Brazilian government tried to ban Michael from filming that movie. You know, they was chasing the 2004 Olympics and wanted to hide the poverty of the favelas. You know, they didn't want the world to see the struggle. They wanted to see the skyline. But Mike wasn't there to film a travel commercial. He was there as a Secretary of State for the people they were ignoring. You know, he went where the government was afraid to go. He negotiated with the people on the ground because the people at the top didn't care about them like that. So, and when you see him in that video with those drummers, you're seeing a man who uses fame to shine a light on the truth that the media and the government wanted to keep in the dark. And this is why critics are dogging this new movie out. They don't want to admit that a black man had more influence and more heart than a whole government administration. They want to talk about his face, but we want to talk about his force. And this is why I say the critics will only give part 2 5 stars if they want to focus on his changing face and the lighter skin, because it lets them ignore the black pride he was putting in his art. They would rather talk about the allegations and the tabloid rumors than talk about why he was putting African history on the world stage. They want to see the tragedy, but we want to see the king who never forgot where he came from. And unfortunately, a lot of us didn't realize that when he was here, because, a lot of people would say he bleached his skin while ignoring the fact that he had vitiligo, a skin disease. Then they say he only dated white women, and they would point at his kids and claim that he was trying to erase his heritage. And though that remains a mystery, because none of those kids look like a Jackson at all, since you would think he'd have kids that look more like his nieces and nephews, but at least they were raised by a black man. They were shaped by his heart and his history, and we ain't got to worry about them being part of a system or the media that tries to turn us down, because they were raised by the man who was fighting that system every single day. They knew Michael Jackson better than any of us ever will. But again, look at the numbers. The critics gave it a 31%, but the fans 96% on Rotten Tomatoes. That's a generational gap. The critics just remember Wacko Jacko, but we remember the man who gave us Man in the Mirror and We Are the World. And the media wants you to forget that Michael Jackson was a winner. They want to skip the coronation and go straight to the crucifixion. But I could tell that this movie is going to prove that his policy of black excellence is still the gold standard. He's a cultural icon, and we got to look at the difference between that and a political one, because we just saw the third attempt on Trump's life. Now, we should never ever wish harm on the president, and I'm glad that he wasn't injured, but it's a reality check, and it proves that despite the tough guy talk or the Messiah image, the Secret Service was just protecting a man, a regular human being, regardless of how anyone feels about him. Now, compare that to Michael Jackson. Michael wasn't trying to be a god, but he had a Jesus-like impact on people. Because think about it, nobody was ever trying to take him out. His security and his bodyguards wasn't there to stop attackers. They were there to stop people from loving him too hard or accidentally crushing him. He was the Secretary of State for culture in general, really, because he brought people together, whereas politics usually pulls them apart. And he had more cultural influence than most people sitting in the Oval Office, because, a president has power, but Mike had influence, and that's a completely different beast. And it makes me want to ask, who else can command the world's attention like that without ever holding a seat at a single political office? You got to think about that. But that's just how I feel about it. But this is Big Brother's Perspective. I'm out. Peace.